All right. Darren, are we good? Can you hear me? You guys can hear me? Yes, sir. All right. It is 10 after, so we're going to dive right in. How is everybody? Good, awesome. First off, I want to thank those of you who came to Science of the Crucifixion. Thank you for putting up with me. I was so nervous there. I was literally going on an hour of sleep, more coffee than should be legal in the lower 48 states, and my nerves were absolutely shot. So thank you for coming to that and putting up with it. It's because of your feedback to that we're here tonight. So thank you for coming and being a part of that with us. Thank you, guys. On that note, there's someone else I want to talk about. If you did not see that and you would like to, it turns out Darren was being stereotypically awesome, as he is, and actually recorded it and put it on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see that, go there. And yeah, let's give Darren a round of applause. We couldn't do any of this without him. Thank you, Darren. All right. So last time we did Science of the Crucifixion. Tonight is evidence for the resurrection. And it needs to be said up front, this is a wholly different conversation than science of the crucifixion. Hence the change from science of to evidence for. The idea is that we're not looking again at a medical examination of what happened to Jesus, what he endured when he was crucified, but rather tonight is a discussion on the reliability of eyewitness accounts of a man raised from the dead and whether those accounts can be trusted. It's the difference between a medical examination, medical science, versus a historical investigation. How a person died versus how do we trust the outlandish claims that person who died came back from the dead are two completely different topics, and we have to approach them in two completely different ways. It'd be like talking about the Titanic, for instance. There's a difference between talking about how someone may have died by plunging into icy, cold, sub-zero North Atlantic waters versus was there a ship called the Titanic at all, and can we prove it, and can we historically verify it? That's the disparity of the conversation that we're having tonight. The problem with the scientific method in terms of our conversation tonight is that science cannot allow us to duplicate historical events. So in this case, or in the Titanic's case, we can't replicate, we can't duplicate the sinking of the Titanic or anything like that. And in this case, we cannot duplicate the setting in which Jesus was claimed to have raised from the dead and the Christian movement kickstarted and literally changed the history of the world as we know it. This is not a question of what happens to the human body under extreme psychological and physical distress, but rather a question of whether we can trust the writings that report the physical resurrection of the man who endured them. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. So this is not just an important issue for Christians. This is the pivotal issue for all who encounter Christ's claims, whether or not he rose from the dead. We can get caught up in the teachings of Jesus, what he said, what he claimed to be, how we should interpret what he said and what we should do with him as a historical figure. But all of those pale in comparison to whether or not he rose from the dead. Everything hinges on whether or not he did. As Tim Keller put it, if Jesus rose from the dead, we accept all that he said. If Jesus did not, who cares about anything that he said? Our whole system of belief, who we believe God is, who we believe we are to God, our place in the world, in the universe, we are gambling as Christians on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. This doctrine, this belief that we as Jesus followers live and die by. This is everything for us. This is not an issue of, how old the world is, not the question of free will. This isn't an argument over how we baptize or how we interpret Revelation. All of those are important questions. They should be answered. But who we are in relation to God, who we are in relation to ourselves, whether we matter at all hinges on whether or not Christ is raised from the dead. And that's not just modern scholars talking. If you flip over, and you're welcome to, we'll have it in these Bibles, but I can just read it for you too. If you flip over to 1 Corinthians 15 and you go down to verse 12, Paul actually says this himself, and this is verses 12 through 19. But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we have been found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. But if he did not raise him, in fact, the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep or died in Christ are lost. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. In other words, if Jesus was not exactly who he says he was, and he did not rise from the dead, then existence is hopeless and Christians are fools. The very founders and fathers of Christianity knew and believed to the point of death, which we'll talk about, that our faith had to be founded on the one truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Anything else renders our faith obsolete. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. It's heavy stuff, but I hope it's going to be fun. I hope it's going to be cool. It's going to be moderately less gory than last time. But as we dive in, I just want to encourage you guys to lean in, take notes. I'd love to answer any questions you have after the fact, but I just want to thank you guys for being here. So we're going to pray because I need it, and then we're going to dive into the evidence for the resurrection. God, thank you for tonight. Thank you for everyone here. Thank you for bringing them here. And God, I ask that your truth will just be made known tonight, that I won't say anything I want to say, but rather I'll say what needs to be said, that folks won't hear what they want to hear, but rather they'll hear what needs to be heard. And God, that this won't just settle on stagnant souls, but rather we'll be able to take this, to learn from it, to grapple and wrestle with it, and then take it to our families, to our friends, to our classrooms and workplaces, God, that because of what you're doing here tonight, we can just be a gift to our community and make heaven a little more crowded for your sake. God be with us. Amen. So, all right, let's do this. As I said, this topic is wholly different than what we did last time. We're not looking at a medical examination. We are asking, how do we interpret and understand documents, these eyewitness accounts and reports that are over 2 millennia old? The biggest challenge in studying for this conversation, however, was trying to decide where to stop, because you could go really as far as you wanted in terms of defending the faith with this topic, right? Because you start with these eyewitness accounts of, Jesus was, he was reported to be alive by this person and this person. And that really, encapsulates the whole Gospels, because all of them are making claims about who Jesus was and what he did post-death. But Paul talks about it too, so that's kind of the whole New Testament. But that's also building on the Old Testament, so you really got to hold the whole Bible into question, and does God exist? So if you really wanted to, this question can go as long and as in-depth as you want it to, but for our sake tonight, in the interest of time, which I don't have a good track record of keeping, we're going to keep things mainly on the eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, those claims of Jesus' resurrection. The followers of Jesus, the men and women, claimed to see Jesus previously very dead, walking and talking, alive and well, around Jerusalem and Galilee. So, although a side note on the existence of God, as long as the existence of God is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history by raising Christ from the dead. That was a quote by William Lane Craig. If you're in the camp that believes that God exists, that he created the universe, that matter, space, and time are all a ex nihilo, created from nothing thing that God gave us, the greatest miracle of all is existence, then the resurrection and really any other miracle that we encounter is a no-brainer. That's nothing compared to just us being here and existing. So if you believe in God, you're already most of the way there, so good. Now, what's interesting is that most scholars believe the doctrine of the crucifixion and resurrection is established by the apostles relatively early. In fact, way earlier than I was even anticipating when I was reading this. Paul recites what appears to be an early creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which, if we believe the chronology of the New Testament, the order in which things are read and understood to have happened, this would have happened 3 to 8 years after the crucifixion. That was a little confusing. There's a creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 that he had to have received within 3 to 8 years after the crucifixion. Now, Paul got this creed when he was either in Damascus or Jerusalem following his encounter with an allegedly alive Jesus after the crucifixion, right? Paul's receiving the creed from the apostles would have only been a few years after the crucifixion. This would have been in the late 30s, early 40s AD. And one scholar who was particularly bold, and he didn't really give any evidence to say why, but he said it, that this creed may have been formulated within months of Jesus' crucifixion. He was saying that after Jesus died and rose again, this creed, this formulated way of thinking and understand who Jesus was and what he did may have been come up with by the apostles within months of that actually happening. So what exactly is this creed? Well, I'm going to read it for you. This is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. This is Paul speaking. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, being Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. The NIV is weird because that last verse isn't Paul admitting to looking like Sloth from the Goonies or anything. That's not what abnormally born means. Read literally any other translation, and what he's saying is that he regrets that he was born in such a way that he was late to the party, that he wasn't born at a time when he could have joined the Jesus movement. And from there, if you keep reading in 1 Corinthians, and you'll get to the passage we read earlier, that creed transitions to Paul telling his own story, having encountered Christ. So what does this creed say, having just read it? Well, it says 6 things. 1, Jesus Christ died for our sins. He was buried and raised on the third day. He appeared to Peter, that Cephas fella. He then appeared to the disciples. He then appeared to 500 eyewitnesses, with whom Paul invites his readers to fact check these statements. And then 6, Jesus appeared to Jesus' own brother, James, and the other apostles. If this creed is as early as we think it was, within months, within a few years of the crucifixion actually happening, as far as this creed is concerned, Jesus was definitely dead, and then definitely seen by literally hundreds of people who were willing to confirm his not being dead. And this is essentially the account that we get in the Gospels over and over and over and over again. Now, the Gospel themselves can be a little tricky to a modern reader. They were not written as apologetics books. Apologetics books, as far as the Christian faith is concerned, are writings meant to defend or elevate Christian writing to scrutiny from skeptics. That is not what the Gospels are. That is not what they were intended to be. As author Philip Yancey put it, the goal was not to present a point-by-point case for why the resurrection absolutely happened, rather as an intrusive narrative, the eyewitness accounts of those who experienced the unthinkable, the unbelievable. These are just news reports, eyewitness accounts. They read like that because that's exactly what the Gospels are. That's also why there are, for lack of a better word, this can be kind of a bad word in Christian circles, discrepancies in the resurrection narratives within each gospel. The authors who wrote the Gospels are less concerned with the exact details of the narrative itself, going in and making sure every little minute thing and word is just right. This is a modern standard that authors and critics and scholars have, but it certainly wasn't one that was around in first century Judea, but rather those authors back then, 2,000 years ago, were more concerned with conveying events that served the narrative flow and the story they were trying to tell based around events that they experienced. Now, this doesn't fly for some people, but really there's no reason for it not to. In the realm, I guess, of philosophy, if one thought doesn't jive with a whole other system of thought, if one thing can kind of get into the gears and mess up the thinking of another line of thought, then you just throw out that whole philosophy, that whole line of thought together. William Lane Craig, a noted apologist today, notes that that is not the historian's craft. what we do, not me, but what historians do when we have multiple perspectives, details, and spotlights on different individuals, that actually helps us verify the story, know what was happening to a greater depth, and it illuminates the event in question to a greater and fuller extent. So when you have these different retellings of the same story, it allows more credibility because you're getting different people experience it in different ways and then coming back to say, yes, this definitely happened. If they were all coming back and saying the exact same thing word for word, well, that would smell like people just copy and pasted. And there's no way to verify whether that original story that was copy and pasted from would be true. Does that make sense? Yeah, so multiple people writing about the same event makes sense, especially when they're doing it in their own words. If 4 of us went to a Cats football game, we would all likely cover the major beats of the game if we were retelling what happened and, what were the plays and, whatever happens at a Cats game. But our descriptions, our interpretations, our writing styles would all differ wildly. But no one would look at the discrepancies in our writings, our differences in what we told and how, and say that the disparity in our records meant that Cats game didn't actually happen, right? Like if we have 4 different people who write different things but cover the same beats about how that Cats game went down, no one's going to look at the differences in our writing and say, well, that game must not have happened, right? Okay. Now, as we move on, so if you want a quick reference from these narratives that we're going to be going through, here's the resurrection narratives in the gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The question regarding these passages is whether or not they are reliable. We have them, they're here. The question is whether or not we can trust them. They certainly seem to be with the crucifixion, which we talked about last time, in that one, they pass the criteria of embarrassment. We're going to use that word a lot tonight, or that phrase, rather. The criteria of embarrassment would be something like I just did. I'm admitting that I can't pronounce criteria of embarrassment. Criteria of embarrassment is essentially saying that when someone writes something about themselves that's not flattering, that doesn't elevate them, that actually it compromises their character, if they're writing it about themselves, it's probably more likely to be true. Especially in the ancient world where often you see military and political leaders writing in such a way that they would often alter their stories or flip the narrative away so that they always come up on top, look good, whatever it is. But because, as we went through the crucifixion story, and as you hopefully guys did too over the Easter season and Holy Week, what you see is the disciples being cowardly. They betray Jesus. They're hiding. They're describing the physical conditions of Jesus and the humiliation that he suffered on the crucifixion. The crucifixion in and of itself meets that criteria of embarrassment. And they also describe the crucifixion so well that modern doctors, like we talked about, were able to go in and actually diagnose the cause of death in Jesus, which is really interesting that they were able to do that, despite probably not knowing what hypovolemic shock was. But again, describing how a person died naturalistically is different than claims of resurrection. Describing how someone dropped dead is different than making a claim that that dead person is no longer that dead person. It certainly adds to their credit when they've built a whole narrative that appears to be trustworthy up until that point, but there's certainly more to the validity of the resurrection than just that. Now, this serves as an excellent place to dive in. We're just going to run through the basic points of the gospel really quick. If we proved anything last time we were here, 2-3 weeks ago, it's that Jesus was undoubtedly dead when he was removed from the cross. Expert executioners ensured that no victim of crucifixion left Calvary alive that day. From there, Jesus' body is taken by Joseph of Arimathea and placed in a newly carved tomb. That also meets the criteria of embarrassment because Jesus and his family were so poor, they couldn't afford a proper grave. The authors are adamant that a member of the Sanhedrin, one of the main groups, religious groups and official groups of religion at the time, had to go in and pay and allow Jesus to come into their family tomb, their newly carved family tomb, because he couldn't do it for himself. Joseph of Arimathea was a well-known religious leader and authority, so everyone knew where his tomb was. He was a pretty big figure. To be on the Sanhedrin was essentially to be on the Jewish religious Supreme Court. If he had a family plot, a family tomb somewhere in Jerusalem, everybody would have known where it was. This is also Passover week, so Jerusalem is chock full of people. There were certainly an abundance of witnesses at the crucifixion, the burial, and as Paul states in that creed, the resurrection, and was witnessed by the overcrowded city. Jesus is placed in a tomb. He's left there for 3 days. And on the third day, Mary Magdalene and at least 4 other women, according to Luke 24, go to the tomb and find the large stone covering the tomb moved and the tomb itself empty, with the burial hood that would have been placed on Jesus' head folded neatly. Angels appear and proclaim that Jesus is risen and instruct the women to tell the disciples. Mary Magdalene meets Jesus himself. Jesus appears to the disciples multiple times on multiple occasions over the course of about 40 days and then ascends to heaven. He later appears to Paul, who becomes the primary author of the New Testament. The gospel then goes on to spread over the known world to all peoples of all nations and all tribes in spite of the persecutions that they suffer. That's the basic biblical narrative, more or less. So what we get from that story really are 5 bits of evidence that we're interested in tonight. Those 5 points are: 1, the women's testimony; 2, there was an empty tomb and a missing body; 3, there were multiple independent post-death experiences by various people; 4, there were conversions of enemies and skeptics after the crucifixion of Jesus. And then we see the martyrdom of the apostles themselves. Okay? And we're going to walk through what all those are and get into them in a bit more in depth. But there are certainly more evidences than just that. But we're going to stick with these main 5, as these are the biggins, as we would say in the South. To explain these facts that we have from the biblical narrative, there are 4 main explanations in mainstream academia and scholarship regarding attempts to explain the resurrection. There are 4 main theories. Is it all right if I switch to this? We'll come back to it. 2 seconds? Okay. I'm going to do it. Okay, cool. It's not that I don't like you. I have to be out of here by 7. My wife told me. Cool. So there are 4 theories to explain these 5 pieces of evidence, and here's what they are. The first one is the mythic theory. This is one way to explain those 5 points of evidence. The resurrection and miracles were added later, centuries later, after the crucifixion of Jesus, to embellish the life and death of Jesus, to give him a kind of a legendary status. So the idea is that, yeah, Jesus was a real person, and he probably did stuff, but the miracles, the crazy stuff that he was supposed to have done, and certainly the resurrection, all that was just added later by followers to make Jesus look cool, good, and elevate him to a legendary status. That's the mythic theory. The conspiracy theory, as you may have guessed, the disciples themselves, the followers of Jesus, stole and hid the body to keep the Jesus movement going and to elevate themselves, to make themselves look good, to say, the body is gone and we follow Jesus, so that makes us look cool and great somehow. The third one is the hallucination theory. This one gets interesting. We're going to get into it too. Eyewitnesses who saw Jesus post-crucifixion only thought they were seeing the resurrected Jesus, but were instead experiencing vivid mass hallucinations. And the last explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead and was in fact seen by hundreds of people, just as Paul said. Now, there are certainly other theories out there. Everything from swoon theory, which we talked about last time, that Jesus didn't actually die, he just kind of fainted on the cross. I think we kind of debunked that last time. Everything to Jesus didn't actually die, he had a twin brother. There's all sorts of weird things out there. These are the 4 main ones that we are going to stick with. Before we dive in, though, to all of these, I want to address that all of these have their problems. All of these have their problems. The mythic theory, the sources cited that we're talking about in both the Gospels and the Creed from 1 Corinthians 15, they're all super early. They're happening 3 to 8 years after the crucifixion. Mark, which most scholars agree was the first gospel written, and he may have actually had an earlier source that dates back to the late 30s, so within 5 years of the actual crucifixion, he writes a fairly simplistic account of the resurrection. So the closer you get to the time that we actually get to crucifixion, the closer you are to that, the less, I I guess, legendary and cool the resurrection story is, because people come in later and they do try to add legends and they do try to embellish the story. If you haven't heard of it, there's a text called the Gospel of Peter that shows up in the 2nd century, 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And it's likely a Gnostic text. It's not in your Bibles. But it wasn't written until 100 years later, well after the events had taken place. And it describes the actual cross that Jesus was buried or killed on, walking and talking and proclaiming the good news of his resurrection. It gets outlandish. That, we would say, is mythic. But what we actually have in our Bibles, what we have, goes back so early and is so close to the crucifixion itself, there really wasn't time for the story to be embellished, elevated, given all these fictitious liberties to make it look cooler, which is cool. For the conspiracy theory, how the disciples would have managed to bypass a Roman guard, break into a tomb, steal a body, fold some of the grave clothes, hide a body that no one has ever found, all on the busiest, most crowded week of the year for Jerusalem, is absolutely beyond belief. Matthew goes so far as to mention this as a competing theory and does his best to explain why that cannot be true, why the conspiracy cannot be true. And you can read about that in Matthew 28. And as we'll talk about too, people do not typically endure torturous deaths for something they know to be a lie. Finally, the hallucination theory. Hallucinations themselves, as psychological events, are well documented, but they're typically based around one sense. So what you'll see is that individuals who have or encounter hallucination, they're typically based around one sense by which we fill the world. Like they'll think they see something, or they'll think they hear something, or they'll think they touch something, but almost never. It's super, super rare. It does happen, but it's super, super rare. Almost never do you have a multi-sensory hallucination. Does that make sense? Like you may think you see something, that could be a hallucination. You may think you hear something, that can be a hallucination, but people almost never have a hallucination in which they both see and hear. And the gospel authors describe themselves seeing, talking to, touching, and even eating with Jesus and smelling the fire that he made their breakfast on too. And it's not just one person, but Paul says several hundred. And here's the thing, with the hallucinations, it's not just one person did, right? If Paul's right, then 500 people saw Jesus alive. That would call for a thing called a mass hallucination, in which several people experience the same hallucination and report back on it. That's what some skeptics will claim. 500 people seeing, hearing, and experiencing and reporting the exact same thing doesn't happen. The academic literature itself is like mass hallucinations probably aren't actually a thing. If they are, they're super weird, and we'll get to why. But what, Brian, we had 800 people at Easter service last week. That would be like me going to each and every service and saying, y'all, wasn't that a crazy dream we had last night? It doesn't happen. That's not the way hallucinations work. That's not the way that they've been reported on. That's not the way psychoanalysts understand them. People don't just hallucinate and see the same thing. And that's actually coming from an academic book called Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. So I'm sure that's good reading. So as far as I'm concerned, because multisensory hallucinations are so rare, and because mass hallucinations are probably not a thing, as far as I'm concerned, not the literature, as far as I'm concerned, the hallucination theory would be as miraculous as the resurrection itself. And finally, for the resurrection theory, it's the least probable. It really is. People do not just rise from the dead. It doesn't happen. If rising from the dead was a common occurrence, there'd be no need for me to be here. We would not need to defend or find evidence for the resurrection. There would be no contention over whether or not it did happen. So you guys with me? All right, we are going long. So let's go into this. Hopefully we fly through this fairly quickly. What we're going to do is we're going to look at our 5 bits of evidence. We're going to look at the women's testimonies, the empty tomb, the missing body, the appearances of Jesus to multiple people over multiple days, the conversion of skeptics and enemies of Christ and the Christian movement. We're going to look at the martyrdom of the apostles, and we're going to see how they compare to each of our different explanations and how they fit. First off, women's testimony. Women not only reporting the empty tomb and the risen Jesus, but being the first to report it actually meets the criteria of embarrassment. Women were of such low status in first century Judea that their testimony was not even admissible in court. I have 4 quotes here. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. That was Josephus. The Talmud says any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Rabbi Eleazar, a 2nd century Jewish teacher, said, let the words of the law be burned rather than committed to women. So there's that. And then Celsus, who was a 2nd century Greek philosopher, a critic and opponent to the early church, actually tried to discredit the whole Christian movement in the early church based off that the first people to report this so-called resurrection were women. This is not me saying this. I love women. I married one. But the idea here is that the women at the tomb were listed as the first witnesses of the resurrection, not because at that time they were good witnesses, but because they must have been the best witnesses that they had. It's not because they were the best witnesses you could have had, it was because they were the only witnesses they had. If a crap witness is all you got, it's what you go with, right? And it validates the account. N.T. Wright notes, he's a well-renowned New Testament theologian, that the women claimed Jesus had risen should have been like shooting the Christian movement in the foot. Instead, it shows the resurrection's credibility, as it would have never, ever been something the followers made up. And if you notice, if you go back to 1 Corinthians 15, that creed, it talks about Jesus appearing to a lot of people, but not to the women. Women were of low status, so that the authors of the Gospels include them being not only the first to report, but to encounter Jesus is huge. Now, how does that line up with our 4 things here? The mythic theory, adding bad witnesses, bad by first century standards, again, to the tale would not be a great way to elevate Jesus in later centuries. Does that make sense? All right, so we're just going to do a big old X for that one. The conspiracy theory. If the disciples stole and hid the body of Jesus, they'd want someone more credible than mere women to cover their tracks, right? If you're trying to create this elaborate scheme, this elaborate conspiracy, you want someone who's credible to cover your tracks, right? In this case, that would not have been women, so that they were reported. We can say that this was either true or very bad planning by the disciples. The hallucination theory. While we noted that multisensory mass hallucinations are in and of themselves miraculous, we're going to give this idea the benefit of the doubt. Like, okay, maybe the women got excited, and don't worry, we're going to do that for the men too, so don't come at me. But let's just say, yeah, they got excited, and maybe they thought the tomb was empty, or maybe they missaw something, and we'll give this one like a solid meh. Does that sound good? But what does cover this in all of its certainty, with all of, we've talked about why you would include women in the narrative, is that it was true. The women were listed as the first witnesses and reporters of the risen Jesus because they were. So the resurrection theory passes the test of the women. All right, second, empty tomb, missing body. What's interesting about the controversy we see is that no one ever argues about the tomb itself. When we're talking about whether or not all this actually happened, all interested parties are dealing with it being empty and having to make sense of it. Some claim that 75% of modern scholars accept that the tomb was found empty on Easter morning. That's 3/4 of scholars, historical scholars alive today. One scholar named Jacob Kremer, who was a German Catholic theologian, by far most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Now, as mentioned, Matthew mentions the competing theory of the disciples stealing the body as a means of debunking it early. Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, wants you to know that, hey, people are saying that we stole the body. That didn't happen, and here's how you can check. The claim of disciples stealing the body was being used by Jewish skeptics all the way into the 2nd century as well. So that was an idea that showed up fairly early on and hasn't gone away since. The critics of the Christian movement had no body to present. Everyone's arguing about the empty tomb itself, trying to figure out where the body went, but at no point does anyone show up and say, like, well, here's the body, what do we do with it? So the empty tomb was never in question. Rather, everyone was asking what happened to Jesus himself. Real quick, there was a tablet called the Nazareth inscription that was found in 1878, and on it was a decree made by an unknown Caesar ordering capital punishment for grave robbers. It is highly debated what this tablet was actually about or in regards to, but some have postulated, and it does seem likely, that it could have been a Roman reaction to Jewish riots incited over the claims of the resurrection by the Christian movement. So the Jewish people who remained Jews were so angry about the claims of resurrection that they start rioting, and Rome, who hates civil disobedience, decides the best thing to do is to make grave robbing a capital offense. You mess with somebody's grave, you die. So early Christians, Jews, and Romans were all dealing with this issue of a missing body. Everyone seems to acknowledge that the tomb is empty and are arguing over where the body of Jesus went. How did it get out of the tomb? Where did it go? Rome would not have stolen the body. Rome did not care what happened to some Jewish carpenter after they killed him. On a much smaller level, it would have been in the best interest of the Romans guarding the tomb that the guy that they had been ordered to watch and make sure he stayed dead. So as far as the Romans are concerned, at a high level, they don't care. For the guards themselves who were actually watching the tomb, it would have been in their best interest if they were actually able to fulfill their commission of making sure a dead guy stayed dead. Jewish leaders wouldn't have stolen the body. They wanted Jesus dead and forgotten. That was the whole point of killing him. And the disciples most likely wouldn't have stolen the body. They are shown hiding, not expecting anything, or even interpreting Jesus' teachings as means for believing in his resurrection. And they had no reason to move the body as they were not expecting nor believed in a singular resurrection at that time. At that point, Jewish folks were looking towards the final resurrection when God makes all things new, like we are. But the idea that a single resurrection of a single Jewish teacher, the Messiah, was fairly novel in their understanding of things. Also, if the disciples had stolen the body, Matthew would not have mentioned that as a competing theory. Otherwise, that would have implicated, it's like, oh yeah, by the way, some guys are saying we stole this. We totally did. That wouldn't have happened. If the disciples had stolen the body, why describe themselves as cowardly and doubting the reports of the empty tomb from the women? If they had stolen the body, why wouldn't they just be out there themselves proclaiming, yes, Jesus is back, and we don't have to have women proclaim it, mere women. We can tell everyone ourselves. Why would they allow bad witnesses to do their job for them? And where would they have taken the body during the most busy time of the year in Jerusalem? During Passover, when all these multitudes of people were around the entire region for an extended period of time, where would they have taken the body? They didn't. So, the mythic theory. The early creed notes that Jesus rose from the dead, so the empty tomb is not a later embellishment. The conspiracy theory. The disciples had no reason to steal the body as they were not expecting any kind of resurrection, and until Jesus actually reappears at his own behalf, they are shown hiding and cowardly, which also again meets that criteria of embarrassment. You can read about that in Mark 9. The hallucination theory is interesting. Again, multisensory mass hallucinations would be miraculous if they were a thing, but they do not account for multiple individuals and officials from different views and agendas, and on the most crowded weekend of the year, reporting an empty tomb. So, nope. But there is one that actually works out. If Jesus did rise from dead, then he would have left the well-known tomb of Joseph of Arimathea empty. Now, moving right along. Next, we have multiple independent post-death appearances of Jesus. Jesus shows up to Mary, he shows up to Peter, the disciples, his brother James, and other apostles multiple times over a 40-day period. These were often, if not always, in group settings. You can read about that in Acts 2, Acts 13, and again 1 Corinthians 15. And all of these appearances of Jesus were multi-sensory experiences. You can read about that in Acts 10, and Acts 22, and Acts 26. So what do we make of this? And this is really where we want to focus in on the hallucination theory itself. But recall again, multi-sensory hallucinations are rare, and mass hallucinations, as far as I'm concerned, are not even a thing. So if we believe Paul in his creed in 1 Corinthians 15, upwards of 500 individuals seen and interacting with Jesus over the course of a 40-day period, to reduce that to a hallucination is creeping towards, if it's not already, just a pure and simple miracle in and of itself. Even so, let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, the disciples might have been hallucinating. If that's the case, we can go in and we can assess the descriptions we're given in the Gospels to determine whether they were in any psychological state that's typically associated with hallucination. So what I mean to say is we're going to just look at the disciples' behavior and see if they were likely to just go tripping. Never mind the several hundred people who claim to have seen Jesus. We're just going to focus in on the 12. When someone experiences a hallucination, there's 4 things that are typically there, if not all of these. They're showing one, if not all of these 4 things. One, when someone experiences a hallucination of an event, there's typically an expectation for that said event to occur. So the idea here is that if you are adrift in a boat at sea and you see, you're stranded and you see a rescue ship on the horizon, but you're only hallucinating it, it's because you were expecting a rescue boat. The disciples are not expecting a resurrection. The Gospels are clear that they are cowardly and they're running for their lives after the crucifixion and during the crucifixion. When the women do show up and report that the tomb is empty, Jesus is risen, we've seen him, they doubt the women's reports and they show fear when Jesus does show up to them behind locked doors. So there was no expectation that Jesus was going to resurrect from the disciples. The second criteria for someone who's going to experience a hallucination is that they show emotional excitement when the event itself is supposed to have occurred. When the women come in claiming to have seen Jesus, claiming that the tomb is empty, they don't react at all. And you can read about that in Luke 24. Eventually they do race to the tomb, but even after that, they're despondent. Number 3, people who hallucinate an event typically have prior information that that event was going to happen. As Jesus predicted his death many times, Matthew 16, Mark 9, Luke 18, this should have been an issue. The disciples should have been ready and expecting Jesus to resurrect because he talked about it throughout the length of his ministry. This should have been huge. However, the gospel authors, again, throughout their accounts, are clear that the disciples did not understand Jesus' predictions of his death or his resurrection, and Mark 9 even says that they were afraid to ask him to explain it. They do not accept the resurrection until after the reported appearances of Jesus to themselves and others. So even knowing that it was going to happen did not make them or put them in a state of mind that is typically associated with hallucination. And 4, varying reports of the event that do not align to one another. The idea there, if you and your buddy are adrift at sea and you both are expecting to see a rescue boat and then you hallucinate, oh, look, a rescue boat. If you see a rescue boat and you see a rescue boat hallucinating, typically you both aren't going to describe the same rescue boat, right? She's going to be like, it's blue. And you're like, actually, it was pink. And it's like, well, the Coast Guard boats aren't either one of those colors. So the idea is that when people have these hallucinations, if they're going to be shared, if they're describing the same event, the details get really sporadic, they get really different, there's a lot of disparities in the details, and they can't be trusted for that reason. Instead, what we see are all the reports have Jesus looking familiar, showing power he did not previously have, talking and often sharing meals with his followers. So how does this line up with our theory? The mythic theory, if these sightings were added later on as a legend, then the worst possible thing that Paul could have done in 1 Corinthians 15 was to tell people and encourage his readers to fact check him. The other apostles were there. They saw it. They claimed to have seen it. If the worst thing that they could have all been doing is to tell each other and tell their readers to fact check with others. The creed is also too early to be a mythic enrichment of the account. So everything is too early, and the worst thing you can possibly do about pretending to have seen somebody or adding stories later on to embellish it is to tell people to check your sources. The conspiracy theory, if the disciples did steal the body of Jesus, it would have been in their best interest to lie about having seen Jesus. If that makes sense. If the disciples did steal their bodies, the body of Jesus, it would have been in their best interest to lie about having seen Jesus, just because... Hold on, I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm actually going on 3 hours of sleep right now, so better than last time. Let me gather this. Yeah, appearances. If the disciples stole the body of Jesus, then it would make sense that, they would go around claiming to have seen him to get the story of resurrection started. But they also did it at great danger to themselves because they would be impoverished, tortured, and killed for that. So if they did steal the body, it makes sense that they would be like, oh yeah, Jesus is resurrected, and we saw him, he's here totally. And so we'll give that a solid meh as well. In terms of hallucination, again, multi-sensory mass hallucinations would be miraculous if they were a thing, but here we see that the disciples did not match the criteria associated with those who experience hallucinations. The disciples did not hallucinate. If they did, we are missing major data from their actions, their behavior in regards to the Gospels and Passion Week leading up to the resurrection. And the resurrection theory in and of itself does pretty well. If Jesus did rise from the dead, and he met, talked, ate with, touched, and was experienced by his followers and several hundred others, this is exactly what you would expect. I forgot to mark off hallucination. We're not giving it anything here. Get out of here, hallucination. Awesome. All right. We're going to keep going. We are almost through. And if anyone needs to leave, well, I guess I was going to say mainly my wife, but I have the keys in my pocket, so we can't do that. We're going to keep going. Conversion of enemies and skeptics. How did the early church take off so quickly and in such a diverse world as first century Mediterranean world? Why did the apostles not only stick with the Jesus movement, but why did enemies of the movement join it? This is a reminder. Jesus was an impoverished carpenter from a backwater town with a shady family history. In terms of social status, there was nothing about him that should have drawn crowds or started a movement. Even with the incredible teachings that he had that did draw crowds, a humiliating death at the hands of the Romans should have rendered his teachings, his life, his ministry obsolete. What would garner interest in those teachings, in that life, in that ministry, is if those teachings of a poor, illegitimate country boy who was dead, what would garner interest in him was if suddenly people were seeing him after he was supposed to have died. A religion that taught a physical resurrection alongside high ethical demands would have also been outrageous to the Jews and the wider Roman world. Jewish individuals were awaiting a final resurrection, like we talked about. You can read about that in John 11. Not a singular resurrection of one Jewish teacher. Romans themselves and Gentiles did not believe in a resurrection of any kind. And the high self-sacrificial morals taught by Jesus would not have been appealing to Romans in the slightest. What would have enticed both the Jewish people and the Gentiles that we see flocking to the Christian movement would have been claims of Jesus rising from the grave and the ability to fact check it, prove it with eyewitnesses. So that's people, skeptics, Gentiles, people who weren't familiar with Jesus converting. As for the enemies of the faith, we have three. The brothers of Jesus are shown to be skeptics and critical of Jesus' ministry throughout his lifetime. You can read about that in Mark 7 and Mark 3. At least two of them convert post-crucifixion. Paul's 1 Corinthians 15 creed that we've read notes that Jesus appeared to his brother James, who writes the letter to the scattered church we have in our own Bibles, the book of James. Paul later calls James a pillar of the church. You can read about that in Galatians 2. And James is apparently so revered by the other apostles that Paul has to call Peter out for brown-nosing Jesus' brother. You can also read about that in Galatians 2. So James goes from being critical of his brother Jesus and denying his role and status as Messiah, as God, to being one of the foremost leaders of the Christian movement. And Jesus had another brother named Jude who also appears to accept Jesus as Messiah post-death and also writes a New Testament letter. The third is Paul. He's the most famous of the skeptic enemies turned apostles. Paul was actively hunting down Christians to have them imprisoned or killed. You can read about that in Acts 8, Acts 9, and Galatians 1. He claims to have seen the risen Jesus in Acts 9, Acts 26, and Galatians 1, and went on to become the leading missionary of the Christian movement to the Gentiles, going on 3 missionary journeys around the Mediterranean and penning at least 13 of the New Testament books. These all meet the criteria of embarrassment, as the church leaders were not always devout followers of Christ. Rather, they had to be convinced later on. So how does all of that align with our theories? If it's a mythic theory that we're conversing with, Gentiles, Rome, Greeks had plenty of legends and myths to adhere to. A religion of high moral standards based on the teachings of an impoverished Jewish carpenter would have had no appeal to them. There was no reason for them to convert to Christianity. The reports of skeptics turning are too early to have been added later, and no one would have made up lies about the revered church or the revered church fathers having been the enemies of Christ. No one would want to go in and say, "Oh yeah, that guy's really cool, but he used to be the worst." That doesn't happen. It happens in the opposite direction, but not going back and trying to ruin someone's reputation. They're pretty honest about the skeletons in their closets. The conspiracy theory is unlikely. There was no reason for Paul and James and Jude to suddenly convert to a belief they held to be a lie, especially given that it led to both of their tortures and deaths. So the conspiracy theory can be marked out. Hallucination theory. Paul nor James were under the conditions associated with hallucinations, and the kind needed to explain the gospel writings are rare and most likely, again, not a thing. But something that does work here is the resurrection theory. If Jesus did rise from the dead, and his being risen convinced not only disparate peoples across the known world, but skeptics and sworn enemies of the Christian movement. His rising from the dead would be enough to connect and unify all these different peoples across the Mediterranean world. All right, our last one, martyrdom of the apostles. Those who claim to have seen Jesus post-crucifixion lived lives of poverty, being mocked, ridiculed, imprisoned, tortured, and eventually death by execution. What would cause them to do this? The gospel was immediately preached in Jerusalem. We see that in the Gospels, where things were likely still heated and politically, religiously uneasy following Jesus' death. Why would the apostles begin preaching the gospel so soon in the most dangerous place in the world to have done so at risk of their own lives? We have this from a few different places. Paul writes in Galatians 2 that the apostles are still preaching in Jerusalem. Tacitus, a Roman historian, calls Judea the first source of the evil, that evil being Christianity, that began right after the execution of the Christian movement's founder, Christus. I'll give you 2 guesses on who that is. Now, this was done while the situation was still unstable and heated in Jerusalem, when the Jesus movement was still looking to be squashed by the same religious leaders who had Jesus executed. Were the apostles to make up lies about Jesus' resurrection, it would have been in their best intentions to either wait until things cooled down or to move somewhere else. And that's typically what you see with cults, either going to South America or Utah, where they're going to be free from persecution. That wasn't meant to be a joke. That was a legitimate statement. Jerusalem was literally the most dangerous place for the early followers to be, but the disciples knew that's where the evidence was, that's where the Jewish individuals who needed to hear the gospel were at. And it doesn't do any favors for the conspiracy theory at all. And it's soon after this that we see the real persecution of the Christian movement begin. Jews are expelled from Rome because of the Jewish riotings over the identity of Jesus. That happened in 41 to 54 AD. The historian Suetonius wrote about that. Tacitus writes of Nero's persecution of the church. That went from 54 to 68 AD. Which is where we start seeing most of the apostles being killed off. James, the brother of Jesus that we talked about, was killed in 62 AD. Clement of Alexandria notes that James was thrown from the top of the temple in Jerusalem, and when that didn't kill him, he was stoned to death. Paul writes about intense persecution throughout his works, Colossians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and then Clement of Rome writes that Paul and Peter were killed in Rome for their faith sometime between 62 and 64 AD. Under Emperor Nero. The Christian tradition of the deaths of the apostles are as follows. Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew, crucified on an X-shaped cross. Thomas was speared to death. Philip was likely crucified. Matthew was killed by the sword in Ethiopia. Bartholomew was either crucified, drowned, or skinned alive and beheaded, depending on who you read. Simon may have been sawed in half. Matthias was crucified. And James the apostle, different James than the brother of Jesus, was killed by the sword. And it's important to note this is wholly different than the martyrs of other religions, and even Christians who are killed for their faith today. The founders died believing in the resurrection explicitly. This was not dying out of a strength of their faith per se, but out of trusting their own experience. Had they known the resurrection to be false, had it all been a lie, it is far less likely, historically speaking, when other movements have met their end, that all of the followers would have embraced death rather than admit they lied. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah, all of the followers would have rather gotten out of death rather than admit that they lied. Apostles did not gain anything from the establishment of the Christian movement. They got poverty, they got imprisonment, they got torture, they got death. Those are not reasons to start or maintain a lie. They got nothing out of it. And if it were a lie, that lie should not have survived persecution. Charles Colson was special counsel to President Nixon. He said, perpetrators of Watergate, even though they were in on the scandal, quickly turned on the president when they were captured and realized their own lives, reputations, legal consequences, and prison were possibly on the line. So when people are part of a lie and they get caught and things get real, they typically backtrack real fast. And we don't see a single apostle doing that. Seeing how at any point in the face of danger and death, the witnesses could have lived by simply recanting their accounts or admitting that the resurrection was a lie, how does this fit with our four theories? Mythic theory? No, it doesn't. There are multiple early attestations of the persecution and martyrdom of the apostles. There's multiple people, even secular scholars, who talk about the apostles were dying for their faith. They were dying believing that they had seen the resurrected Christ. This was not added on later to embellish the story, so we can mark that out. Conspiracy theory: why would the disciples make up a lie and then stick to that lie, as all it brought them was poverty, mockery, torture, and death all over the first century? Conspiracy theory doesn't work out. Hallucination theory: while hallucinations of the caliber needed to explain the actions of the disciples have never been observed or recorded, if they did, it is conceivable that they could have inspired such devoted belief in the apostles. They probably weren't hallucinating. We've established that. But just to give them the benefit of the doubt, meh. All right? But if Jesus did rise from the dead and the apostles did see him alive, it would make sense that they went to their graves believing that they had seen the actual Jesus alive and well. So wrapping this up, so there we have it. How do our 5 pieces of evidence line up with our 4 theories? The mythic theory does not work when working with the data from the earliest manuscripts that could not have been made up. The conspiracy theory cannot account for the testimony of the women or the disciples, why the tomb was empty, a missing body in an overcrowded city, the lack of expectation of any party of an actual resurrection, the martyrdom of the disciples, or the conversion of skeptics and Gentiles. The hallucination theory only works, again, if one holds that multisensory hallucinations, which are incredibly rare, were experienced by 500 individuals, improbable if not miraculous. This does not account for the skeptics and the Gentiles converting, and it certainly doesn't account for the empty tomb itself. The resurrection theory is the best fit with all the evidence we have from the earliest manuscripts and what we see preserved in our Bibles today. It has explanatory scope. That means it can explain all the facts and data derived from the earliest reports and manuscripts. It has explanatory power, and it explains the data, meaning it explains the data with the least amount of effort or contrivances, and it illuminates history. It shows why the Christian movement started and its staying power. Historian C.B. McCullough, which is Scottish, I assume, notes that the resurrection fills these 3 criteria for historical reliability better than any other explanation or theory for the empty tomb and post-death sightings of Jesus. That said, it is less plausible and less ad hoc than the other theories as well. Ad hoc is an argument that's made, put it like this. An example of an ad hoc is making up a lie to cover other lies, just making assumptions to cover other assumptions. It doesn't appear to be making too many other assumptions. Dr. Travis Campbell retorts to McCullough, basically saying the resurrection theory does pass the ad hoc criteria as it only makes one assumption, the existence of God, as we talked about with William Lane Craig. As for plausibility, that Craig quote again, the resurrection theory is only implausible if there is already doubt regarding the existence of God. Now, when viewed as a whole, the evidence is pretty, I had a word here, I'm going to say darning instead. Some of you will catch that later on. Likelihood of empty tomb claims in Jerusalem, of documentation of first claims of the resurrection, emergence of Christendom from Jerusalem, Paul and James being converted, and the disciples' belief in resurrection, all of those happening without the actual resurrection happening, all of those happening without Jesus coming back from the dead. The possibility, the probability is practically nil. It is more probable, given the rise and staying power of Christianity 2,000 years later, that the resurrection did occur than any other suggested theory and explanation. I hope that we have established that the least likely possibility for explaining the Christian movement and the resurrection is simply a means of mass deception. As N.T. Wright, that New Testament theologian, puts it, the early Christians did not invent the empty tomb and the meetings or sightings of the risen Jesus. Nobody was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have invented it, no matter how guilty or how forgiven they may have felt, no matter how many hours they poured over the scriptures. To suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and to enter into a fantasy world of our own. And even so, if it were a lie, it should not have changed culture as it has. Suddenly, our entire measurement of how we view history is being based around that of a Jewish carpenter. Culture went from honoring kings and royalty to revering fishermen. As J.P. Moreland put it, we went from revering kings, but now we name our kids Peter and Paul, and we name our dogs Caesar and Nero. I would like to read one more passage tonight, and I'll close us with this. This is after the crucifixion, after the resurrections, just before Jesus ascends to heaven. This is from Matthew 28. Here, and we actually have it on our wall out there when you enter. Here he appears to his followers in Galilee, and Jesus says, we see this verse right before Jesus begins talking. This is before Jesus' ascension into heaven. Matthew 28, starting in verse 16. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Many people, as Matthew says, looked Jesus right in the eye after his resurrection and still doubted their own senses and experience. It is completely possible to stand in the light of confounding evidence and just ignore it. We see this all the time today. Just ask the flat earthers. Which is why tonight is called the evidence for and not the science of. Science can be demonstrated, but historical evidence must be accepted. We have to ask ourselves, me and you, what we believe and why. If we don't accept the resurrection, what about the evidence has left you unconvinced? What, if anything, do you think could convince you? What would it take? Those are good questions to ask yourself if you are not convinced of the resurrection. But if you do accept the resurrection of Jesus, why do you do that? Is it because you like his teachings? You like the things he says? Is it just that you were raised to believe that the resurrection is true, so you do? Or do you believe that Jesus was who he says he was, that his resurrection is plausible, historical, and verifiable? And if you do, how are you following him, obeying his commands, and adhering to his teachings? If you say Jesus is Lord, if you say he is Lord of your life, if you say he truly is resurrected from the dead and thus vindicated as the Son of God, are you living like it? Am I? So, if we want to, if we are followers, Jesus asks us to live in light of his life, death, and resurrection by doing one simple thing: making disciples, telling people the good news and evidence for the new life they have in him. Continuing where Matthew leaves off, where we just left off in Matthew 28, starting in verse 18. All authority, Jesus says, in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That's the meaning of the resurrection. Let's pray. Let's play. Hey, God, thank you for tonight. God, we thank you for, just the evidence for your resurrection. Lord, I thank you that we don't necessarily have to take things on faith, that you've given us accounts, that you gave us credible sources, that you are who you are, God, that we can see who you are in history, and that has repercussions for today. God, I think thank you again for everyone who's here, and again, that this will just be working in our hearts and our minds, that we'll be able to wrestle with it, to understand it on every level that we don't. And because of what you're doing here tonight with Venture as a whole, God, that this will just be ground zero for revival, that you'll be working in all of us for the benefit of our friends and families and this city, Lord, that we can just be a gift unto Bozeman. And that because of what you're doing here and now in our hearts, because of what we get to have in you in your resurrection, Lord, that Bozeman will be a bit more crowded. Heaven will be a bit more crowded with folks from Bozeman. Man, and I ask for great sleep for me tonight. God, thank you for who you are. Thank you for your love. Thank you for the hope we have in your resurrection. Amen.